See you later. Laconia is going to be our MC for today, so I'm just here to welcome you all. And if you are going to get up to say anything, please stand here in front of that microphone because SU is videotaping it. There are many people who wanted to be here who could not be, so we'll post it all later. So, mwah!
So the first thing I want to say is the wine is the compliments of Peg O'Sullivan. She and I drank Bogle Cabernet, and we drank Relax Riesling. And when Anne asked what I suggest, I knew the exact wines to recommend. In the movie Chariots of Fire, one of the most iconic phrases was when Eric Liddell said these words, "When I run, I feel his pleasure." I think Peg O'Sullivan would say, "When I hear story, I feel his pleasure." Just for a minute, let's take a moment in silence and honor Peg's memory in pleasure. Carol Birch and Peg shared many conversations over the years, many of which Carol kept in quotes. Carol?
Yes, because Peg was so, what a free spirit, like deep inside, like a free spirit. It's just, so she said, "Some mistakes are too much fun to make just once." Isn't that not wonderful? And then these longer things are things she sent to me, but I felt like they were so much that she would want everyone here to know this. No, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful, beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, and your playing small doesn't serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking, so other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We are born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we subconsciously give people permission to go out and do the same. Shine. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Now, this was attributed to Nelson Mandela, a great man who lived this. He lived this, but in fact it was actually written by Marianne Williamson, who was a kind of new age bent towards shining, shall we say. And then this from Lewis Carroll: "There's no use trying," said Alice. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." And then 2 short quotes. "Happiness comes in through doors you didn't even know you left open." And a truly happy person, truly happy person is one who can enjoy the scenery on a detour. Oh, go, Peg.
Carol? Carol?
What?
Okie dokie. It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Remember that. That's from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And it's going to come up and share some messages from people whose lives were touched by Peg.
Once upon a time, just before the turn of the century, in 1999, the Storytelling Center moved into Winslow, Ames, an historic 1930s modular home which had been moved from the World's Fair in New York to the beautiful Connecticut College campus. It had been newly restored. Our board president's dog had just eaten the kitchen linoleum. We met our housemate from Arts and Tech right after the dog did this, not getting off to a very good start. We were getting ready for the festival, the first one produced without Barbara's input, the one I told Peg I did not have time to do. No, I could not help. What was it about Peg? What was it about her that you couldn't say no? So even though I did say no, I proceeded to help with the festival and became the acting executive director of the Storytelling Center. That was 23 years ago, and I've been the director since then, so you can see what an effect Peg had on my life. The one stipulation to my becoming the permanent executive director was that I would have to get an email address and communicate, especially with Peg, via email. Although at the time I thought this was ridiculous, I went along with this idea and got an AOL account, my first email account. I told Peg that I now had an account and gave her the address. Several days later, I went in to check my email and I was sure that something was wrong with my AOL account because there were 12 messages, and they were all from Peg. I did not know that checking email every day was a thing. I also didn't appreciate how organized Peg was. Each email had a specific subject so that it could easily be accessed and referred to later. Those of you who receive emails from me these days can see what an effect Peg O'Sullivan had on my life. Peg was a master at bringing folks in. Here are some testimonials. From Barbara Reed. Peg has a way of saying, "Can I help you?" And she will. If somebody complains to her about anything, she says, "How can we make it better?" It's very hard to refuse Peg if she asks you to volunteer for something because she herself is so willing to help. And she manages to persuade you that this is really what you want to do. You might not have known that you wanted to do it, but suddenly you find that, of course, you want to do it. From Onawumi. Peg O'Sullivan, an earth angel and consummate collaborator, whose brilliant mind, open arms, and truly sweet heart has launched countless storytellers and developed a lasting place to assemble for those who love storytelling. Leanie Del Siemens. Pego is a fabulous organizer, mentor, dear friend, lover of story, and a marvelous force to be reckoned with. She will be sorely missed. Pat Joyce. I met Peg in 2010 when she was standing in line in front of me during a book signing for J. O'Callahan at the Eric Carle Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts. In her warm and wonderfully chatty way, Peg informed me of the Connecticut Storytelling Festival. After that encounter, my partner Raymond and I became regular attendees at the festival. I can't tell you how many emails I got from people who said they met Peg on some line at the supermarket, and they've been coming ever since. Jim Hawkins. I first met Peg through Barbara Alaprantis when Barbara was doing programs at the Flushing Library. Peg came as a supporter of the program and always in search of new talent. I remember her being so supportive and encouraging to all of us and felt she was sincere. We stayed in touch and I would tell her stories I was working on. She always had insightful, positive suggestions to make. Peg O'Sullivan is one of my heroes and I miss her very much. Mary Jo Machak. Peg-O was love personified. In all the years I knew her, I never felt anything but kindness, appreciation, and encouragement from her, and I am forever grateful. Maude Carpenter. I volunteered on the planning committee for several years, and Peg and I agreed that my most important contribution was to say to her, "Madam President, it's time to move on." In her sincere effort to be sure everyone was heard, Peg was often known to have long meetings. We laughed many times together about this. Dan Yashinsky, a bright light, has now become a guiding star.
Betty McDonald wrote in her book, Hello, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, quote, "The qualities of leadership are not something you attain overnight." Peg O'Sullivan took Barbara Reed's vision and both led and nurtured us. One of those whom she nurtured is Sarah DeBeer, who will share a story in honor of Peg.
Okay, so I'm tearing up right now, so I have to shift gears. The beginning of the pandemic, I suddenly discovered that through Zoom I could go all over the country and the world to open mics and to storytelling programs, and every place I went, Peg was there. And every time I told a story, whether I was in Chicago or Boston or wherever, virtually, as soon as the program was over, the phone would ring and Peg would say, "Oh, I loved hearing you tell that story." And she would talk about details that she'd really enjoyed. And then came the day when both Peg and I had been confused, and we thought the program that started at 7 o'clock Central Time actually started at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. And we were the only two people to arrive in that Zoom room. And I went running down. I said, "Joey, come here, it's Peg." And we had an hour-long visit. And when people started coming for the program, I was like, I'm having a conversation here. But I tell traditional folk tales, and Peg was always so responsive and nurturing about continuing to do what I best loved. And when I thought about the story I wanted to share, what popped up was the story of the elves and the shoemaker. And I thought, why the elves and the shoemaker? And I thought, well, everybody in that story is generous and nurturing and helpful. So as you hear me tell, just think Peg as the elves and Peg especially as the shoemaker's wife. Because there was this shoemaker and he got more and more lost and ignored, and nobody was buying his shoes, and all he had left was one piece of leather. And if he did it wrong, that would be the end. And so he very, very carefully cut that leather so that he could stitch a pair of shoes, but it had taken him so long he wasn't going to be able to stitch it that night. So he left the pieces on his shoemaker's bench. He went to bed. And when he woke in the morning, the piece that had been stitched together into a gleaming pair of shoes, he put them in the window of his shop before a half hour had gone by, someone had come in, paid good money for that pair of shoes, enough that he could buy two pairs of shoes worth of leather. Again, worked so cautiously that he couldn't sew them together that night. He put them out, woke to find two gleaming pairs of shoes. And again, they sold hardly had he put them in the window when they were gone. His wife said, "Who is doing this? Let us stay up and see." And so he put out leather for 4 pairs of shoes. And he and his wife hid, and they watched as these tiny little men just appeared at about midnight. And then they began making these tiny little stitches. He'd wondered how anyone could make as beautifully tiny stitches as the ones that had appeared before him on his shoemaker's bench. And he was so struck by their dexterity, but his wife was struck by the fact that these poor little men had no clothes at all. And so the next morning, as he was putting these shoes out to sell them, and he knew they would sell right away, his wife said, "Husband, we have to do something for those little men. They must be so cold. I will make them clothes, and you make them shoes." And so they did. They made tiny little clothes, tiny little shoes. Oh, we made them with such love and such celebration to thank these tiny men for having turned their lives around. And the day came when they did not leave leather on that bench. They put out the little suits and the little shoes, and they hid and they watched. And those tiny little men jumped up onto the shoemaker's bench and stared down. And they put on the clothes and the shoes, and they began to dance, and they said, "Now we are fine gentlemen, why should we ever work again? Now we are fine gentlemen, why should we ever work again?" And they were gone. And you know, who could I identify their spirits more with than Peg, who was there for so many of us until it was time for us to go off on our own. But at the same time, who could I better identify with Peg as that shoemaker's wife, who was not looking at how well someone did something, but deeply aware of what that individual needed.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't know if many of you knew Holly Adams, Reverend Holly Adams, but in Peg's last years, she and Holly became really, really good friends. Holly was planning on being here today, but yesterday she was diagnosed with COVID. So she couldn't come because she wanted to do what Northeasterners do, protect people. So I'm going to read Holly's letter. It's a little long, so hang in there with me. I met Pego many, many years ago at our church in Rowayton, the one where Celebration has been held for many years. We met because she was the church's most articulate lay liturgist and was often asked to read the Sunday scripture with her meticulous enunciation, intellect, and obvious understanding of what she just read. I too love to read scripture. The first time I did, she came up to me and complimented me on my diction. It was a wow moment. And that's how we met. Our Peg was like no one or nothing else. She was ageless. and she had imagination and a sense of fantasy and whimsy that carried her through her toughest times. Whether it was her imagination and whimsy that made her such a good storyteller, or her good stories which made possible the unimaginable for her, I surely don't know. But after her Stephen died, her life was based around the Storytelling Festival and all its tellers whom she wanted to support. Even as she moved between her idyllic home on the west coast of Florida and her northern homes, first in Rowayton and then in Northampton, she developed networks of friends in those places and in between whom she deeply cared about. Peg made each person she met feel that they were the most important person in that moment. When the Storytelling Festival hosted a roasting of Peg at Connecticut College, I found out that I was a mystery speaker. It was a surprise to me, and I was only informed as I walked in the door. Nice job, Anne. Minutes before the program began. When it was my turn, I did the only thing I knew how to do, and that Peg had taught me to do. I told a story, a true story about, quote, Peg and the Beige Man. In retrospect, I think the story describes the very essence of this woman. Depending on one's point of view, either Peg's car backed into the beige man's car, or the beige man drove into Peg's car. She was able to turn a difficult, even contentious misunderstanding between them into a riotous evening of unexpected camaraderie, nostalgia, and appreciation for all involved. She was also the most optimistic person I've ever known. When her Connecticut home was flooded beyond repair in Hurricane Sandy, she responded, well, maybe it's time for me to go to Northampton anyway. And off she went, creating a whole new village of friends who would do anything for her. When I visited her there, she took me on long walking paths around town where she'd stop and chat with at least half of the other walkers she'd walked into. She took me into her favorite stores and church where she clearly was well known and beloved for the way she made people feel. An invitation to Peg's dinner table was a treat. There was plenty of libation, of course, and she always planned a meal that would not keep her from her guests, and yet it was a 4-star meal. When you were invited to sit down at Peg's table, there would be a favor for everyone. Maybe a party blower, or silly sunglasses, or shells of funny socks, or a container of confetti or feathers to throw up in the air and watch descend on the festive dinner table. One would leave the table feeling replenished not only with good food and drink, but also with loving relationships. She loved having friends over to her second-floor porch for the July 4th fireworks. She'd give out sparklers to her guests and, of course, plenty of food and libation to keep up with the festive occasion. I remarked how she enjoyed bringing people together, turning strangers into friends, and connecting people through mutual interests. I remember the day Peg told me of her visit to a gerontologist who tested her for dementia. She said it was so strange. First, he told the story, and he told it badly, and made it very boring. Then he asked her some unrelated question like who the president was, what month she was born, and in what year it was. Then he asked her to retell the story he'd previously told her. Being the master teller she was, she told me she couldn't help but elaborate on the story, give it texture, and a message. The doctor, of course, not knowing of Peg's great love of storytelling, described her as having advanced dementia. Well, we both burst out laughing. It was at least 5 or 6 years later that a more accurate, more competent diagnosis was handed down. and she accepted it as she'd accepted everything else in her life, with grace. I witnessed her careful distribution of her belongings to her beloved friends in the years that followed. She gave up her Northampton home, knowing that it was time to come home to Florida to live out her days along the Manatee River. She was blessed that her across-the-street neighbor, Jeanette, loved her, as we all did, and took care of her, watching over her and keeping her safe until it became clear that Peg was ready to move to a memory care facility nearby. I choose to remember Peg as I've always known her. "My stars," she'd drawl in that infectious way of hers. I like to think she has found her beloved Stephen, and they are together again. As for me, I am a better preacher because of her, and a pluckier widow who can do anything thanks to Pego. "My stars," I say, and look up to the heavens for that one which shines a bit brighter than all the rest. My star, Pego. Ollie Adams. Lauren Mendoza is going to come up and talk about honoring Peg in November.
I met Peg, I can't even tell you how many years ago. My mother introduced us and my mom said, "You'll like her. She's a sparkler." Truer words were never spoken. And when I met Peg, she went, "Why, hey there!" And her hands were flying like butterflies. And the smile as wide as any I've ever seen anywhere. And of course, she cajoled, mesmerized, arm-twisted me into volunteering for something that very day. And it was at that point only baking cookies for the reception after the Rowayton Celebration. I have been volunteering at the Rowayton Celebration and working with the production team ever since. And it's notable that it is now a production team. It was Pego and her handful of minions, and then it became a staff of thousands, a cast of thousands, and we don't do it anywhere nearly as well as she ever did. Pego cultivated and curated and encouraged and mentored so many tellers for Celebration in Rowayton and the festival in New London. And her gifts have continued. She shared those gifts so generously with all of us and continues to do so today, as witnessed by all of us here. In November the 19th is the traditional Saturday before Thanksgiving, the original Celebration Day. The Rowayton Celebration is I refer to it as the Mac Daddy. The big stage with many tellers and musicians. And November the 19th would be Peg O'Sullivan's 90th birthday. And so we will be honoring her legacy and her life on November the 19th at Celebration in Rowayton. Thank you.
In the book, Timothy Twenge by Florence Hyde and her daughter Roxanne, there's this quote: "This is cause for celebration, a human with imagination." At this time, I'm going to open up the floor for anybody who would like to speak in behalf of Peg.
I think in many ways I feel like Peg gave me my start. Peg heard me tell the story of, oh gosh, it was a Greek myth at the barn in Eli Whitney Barn. And she said, I want you to tell that at the festival for the program on Friday night. And Peg made me feel like I could do anything. I remember in 1990 when we had the National Storytelling Conference at Brown University. And I was going through a really, really difficult time personally, and I wasn't doing very much storytelling. And Peg said to me, so, where are you telling stories now? What are you doing? What are you up to? And I said, well, I'm not really telling stories. I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And she stopped. We were walking between venues. And she stopped me and she said, you're not telling stories because right now you're very busy making stories. And I will never forget that. She always took an interest in my boys and in me whenever we got together or whenever I saw her at a celebration or at the festival. And I had the most wonderful, two in particular, conversations with her shortly before she died. I think she got me confused with somebody else. I don't know if anyone else got any of these phone calls from her, but I got a couple of phone calls from her, and one in particular, she called to sing happy birthday to me and wishing me a happy birthday. And it wasn't my birthday. It wasn't anywhere near my birthday. And we had the most lovely conversations. And even though she didn't remember exactly who I was initially and how we knew each other, her personality, her joy of life, the essence of who she was so intact. And I just felt so incredibly blessed to have received those two calls from her and to have known Peg all these years. And I know that she is probably up there having a wonderful conversation with Brother Blue and cajoling the angels, just as she did to all of us. Thank you, Peg, wherever you are. We love you, and we will continue to carry on your legacy.
I wasn't planning to say anything, but now I feel compelled to. One of the things that I think of Peg, I was on the phone with my father in Japan the other day. When my father visited me, I think it was around 2005, when this was when Steve was still around. And so I took my father, my son, we all went to Peg's old home in Connecticut, and we had dinner, and my father was very taken by Peg. He kept saying, "Oh, how is that beautiful American lady?" And he said, this is many years later, but he still says, "How is that beautiful American lady?" So she made quite an impression on my father. I learned from her what it takes to develop this art form. And it's not just memorizing the story and telling it, but it's the organizing. And I don't even know half the work that it takes to organize things, but I've seen her firsthand. Talking to people, I think her cooking encouraged my storytelling more than many other things. Just writing letters, emails, phone calls, and doing everything, every one of these things with sincere joy and happiness. And that's what I learned from her, Even after she moved into the facility, oh, I really want to tell you this. You know, that we were all feeling, I was feeling bad that she had to, and but few months after she moved into the facility, and we would talk once or twice a week on the phone, she said, you know, for longest time I wanted to go home, and I am sad that I don't get to go home. I understand it now. But then I looked around myself and I saw these other people who also live here, and they need more help than I do. So I made it a point to go around the dinner time, go around giving everybody a hug. And that just absolutely blew me, but just blew me away. That I have. How do I age and become an old woman? You know, I haven't had. I had good example in Peg, so I'm not saying that I would be like her necessarily, because she's the most loving person. I once asked Eshu, who is the most loving person you know? And I wanted him to say me, because well, Eshu is the most loving person, so I wanted him to say me because I love him so much. But he, without hesitation, he said Peg. But it's true, and now I know what to strive for. I was beating up myself that I thought we had a little more time, if I had foolishly thought, but then I looked up. It was a nice day, and I saw her laughing, you know, face, and I heard her saying, "It's all right." And every time I look up at the night sky, then I see that. So, Peg, you left this world, but not our hearts.
First of all, I'd like to say that I did have a memory once, and I put it someplace, but I forget to look for it. So I don't remember exactly how I met Peg to begin with. I just know that she became a very important part of my life. I'd never heard of a storytelling center or a storytelling organization until I met her. But I've been telling stories ever since I can remember. I taught school for 40 some odd years, and I used to tell stories to the kids all the time. They would tell them back to me sometimes. And then I joined a Toastmasters club, and I got to do some storytelling of tall tales, really, in that story in Toastmasters. And one of the things I noticed were street signs. Now, if you've ever really noticed street signs, one of them sometimes will say, "Bump ahead." They don't tell you whose head. And you don't want to bump, I don't want to bump my husband's head because that might distract him from traffic. So I thought I'd bump my head against the window, but I had forgotten that I'd put the window down. So, you know, I couldn't do that. Then it said, "Speed bump ahead." I don't know how to even bump ahead to begin with. So, and then there was another sign that said, it was a big yellow sign, it said "Children." And right below it, now it did have a sign saying "School Zone Ahead." Okay. Then there's a sign said "Children." And then right below it was a big sign said, "Do not park on either side of the road." What? Could adults park on both sides of the road, or just children could not park on both sides of the road? Sometimes these street signs are very, very confusing. And I've had people who now look at street signs and say, "You know, I don't really understand what that street sign is talking about." Because when you take it literally, it doesn't make sense. Well, I was talking to Peg about this one time, and she mentioned several other street signs that she had seen that she said, "That fits exactly what I have been saying all these years. You've got to know, they don't use punctuation." Well, it's true, they don't. And so when it says, "Stop all ways," what? How do they know what ways I'm doing? Who told them that I was going to be driving through that section of town? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And Peg agreed with me on all those things, but she actually got me to start coming to Connecticut Storytelling Center. She got me involved with a lot of things. I've had people who've called me to do storytelling because they've read about
me someplace. And I keep forgetting to look and see what it says in the Storytelling Center about me. But she read about it and she asked me to do some storytelling. But then I found out that she wanted me to do storytelling about creatures that lived in the sea. I didn't know any stories about creatures that lived in the sea. So I had to search it. I was fascinated. I had no idea what's going on in those waters that you can't see at all. So you never know what you're going to learn about life until somebody tells you they want you to tell a story about something you've never even thought about or never seen. So you start researching it and the things you can learn and find out about. And when I go to Storytelling Festival, I hear stories that are fantastic from people that I've never met before. How do they know what kind of a story I want to hear? But they do. And it's fascinating. And you are all part of that group. And I think you're all fantastic people. And I know that you've told me your names, and I remember some of the names, but I don't always remember everybody's name exactly the way it's supposed to be remembered. But I just want you to know how honored I feel being a part of a group like this. You are all fantastic people. And just sitting and talking with you over a piece of watermelon or something, it's interesting. You make it interesting, no matter what. And I think that's fantastic. So I'm glad we have this group and things that we can do through the Storytelling Center. So I want to thank everybody on the Storytelling Center who makes it possible for all of us to get together. Thank you.
In Peg's last years, I was so impressed with how she coped. And I think Eshu was a big part of that. She always said, you put pictures with all her email addresses. And you encouraged us when we sent anything to her, put a picture with it. And she said that was so helpful. We always went down to Jonesboro every year. And there were 4 or 5 women, plus Bill Wright. Bill was the chauffeur, and as he said, it was his weekend for herding cats. But he always brought us all home in good condition. But the last time we went down there, which would have been 2019, I sat next to her on the plane, and she took out a little spiral notebook, and she said, now tell me who we're having dinner with tonight. And we were having dinner with about 14 or 15 people at the restaurant. And so we went through and she wrote down every name and she said, okay, now who is this person? How do I know them? And she wrote it down next to them, and she had 2 or 3 pages in this notebook. And I noticed her, I was at the other end of the table during dinner. She took that notebook out, she looked at the names, and then she went up to somebody and she began talking to them. And then she'd take a little break, she'd look at another name, went and talked to them. So just her coping mechanism impressed me so much. And, you know, if she couldn't remember things, she would just make a joke out of it. In fact, the last time I talked to her, she said, I'm calling you to thank you for something. I can't remember what the heck it is, but thank you anyway. So I said, you know, when I become like that, I hope I'm just like her and have that sense of humor to just keep going and making everybody else feel so good. And
So traveling with Peg was always an adventure because you never quite knew, and this is where the cat herding comes in, you never quite knew where you would find her. Because invariably, as you are rushing along through the airport trying to get to your gate, and then you'd look back and Peg would be back talking to someone, whether she knew them or not. It didn't matter one bit because after she had talked with them, she knew them. One year we went there, and our favorite place to go for breakfast was the Pancake House at the edge of town in Jonesboro. And it's this tiny little place with, lots of tables. And that weekend of Jonesboro is always, obviously, their busiest weekend, I'm sure, of the entire year. And we went in one morning and they were having a very difficult time that morning because one person had called in sick, another person wasn't going to be able to make it anyway. They were very short-handed. And we show up with our usual 4 or 5 or 6 people. There's a table that was open, but still had all of the dishes and whatnot from the previous people who had been there. So we went and sat down, we started stacking up the plates, and Peg promptly picked them up and walked back to the kitchen with them, showing up a few minutes later with a stack of menus. And so we proceeded to figure out. She got up and walked off again and came back with the coffee pot and some mugs, poured us our coffee, stopping at several other tables along the way, pouring their coffee and their extra things. I think she took orders from several other tables and delivered them as well. She took our orders, took them back to the kitchen, came back with our food, was talking to nearly everybody in the place, and in general was being Peg. And that was just not only one of my favorite memories of her, but just it says so much about who she was and how she operated and how much fun she was to be around. So thank you, Peg.
I first met Peg in her early incarnation as a reading teacher. When I moved to Connecticut in 1985 and found an apartment in New Canaan, and Peg was the reading specialist at West School in New Canaan. And I can't remember how we connected, but once she found out I was a children's librarian and we could talk about books, that was the end. And then we used to share rides up to Ridgefield, where there was a story sharing group, and at the Ridgefield Library, and once a month we would be up there, driving up these dark Connecticut roads that were so unfamiliar to me, but Peg always knew where we were going and who we were going to see. She was such a force of nature. And I had the wonderful experience of going up to stay with her in Northampton and experiencing her joy in her home there. And then the pandemic hit. And on Christmas Day in 2020, I was spending the first Christmas day of my life completely alone. My family in Monroe was staying put in their house because it was dangerous, we thought, for all of us to get together. My son didn't come home from California that year. We set up a family Zoom visit, but it's not like, sitting around the table together. And I put together a day for myself and cooked myself one of my favorite dinners and had the family Zoom visit, but in the middle of that lonely Christmas day, the phone rang, and it was Peg. Now, I hadn't talked to Peg in months, and I picked up the phone, and she said, "Connie?" I said, "Yes." "Are you the one who left the plate of cookies in front of my door today?" No, you're down in Florida, Peg. I'm up here in Connecticut. "Oh, well, somebody left me a plate of cookies with a little card that said they were from Connie. Now, how do I know you?" And once we determined how we knew each other and shared some memories of driving up to Ridgefield to the story sharing group and many, many years at the Connecticut Festival, Peg said, "Well, Merry Christmas. I'm so glad we had a chance to talk." Bless you, Peg. You blessed all of our lives so magically.
I don't mean to double dip, but I forgot to tell you something. So Peg encouraged me to produce Telebration in New Milford, which I did, and for about 10 years. And I was so impressed with Peg's being coordinator of the international celebration when it went national, that my most favorite time voting at the polls, I didn't like any of the choices that I had, and I thought about how good a job JG and Peg had done with Telebration, that there couldn't be anyone else better off as president and vice president. And every time I would talk to Peg, I would remind her of that and give her a big giggle. And so I didn't know that writing in, you had to like petition for write-ins, but I wrote in one year for Peg O'Sullivan as Vice President of the United States. And I'm so glad I was able to give her a giggle as a result.
I wasn't sure what I was going to say, if I was going to say anything, but I'm sitting here and I'm thinking of something that Peg always said. I heard it, anyone who ever sat on a committee with her heard it, and I want to say to Anne and Laconia and everyone for showing up today, good on you.
Eshu is going to be starting a video, but before he does that, I'm going to share my Peg story. I met Peg in '93. JG had worked with me on my signature story called Grandma Ruth and Blackie. And he said, you've got to tell that at our storytelling group. And I'm going to just tell you how I felt. Because I would not have said this in '93 because I didn't curse. But I was scared shitless. Because it was a personal story. I didn't know how it was going to go across. And I told that story. People listened deeply. And Peg came up to me and put her hands on my shoulders. And she said, I know storytellers. You're a storyteller. And I carry that with me all the time. Eshu?
I sat with you in times of grief when everything seemed dark. But you came through with your usual grace. Your light to others was the spark. Your light to others was the spark.
When your heart became so weak that you could barely stand, still somehow you found a way to give someone else a hand, to give someone else a hand.
You never let the loneliness or sadness overcome. You learned to love your failing heart as long as there was loving to be done. We gotta learn to love our failing hearts. Learn from you and take that spark, for the love we give is the love we live.
Yours is a memory we will always hold. must be told, that always must be told.
You never let the loneliness or sadness overcome. You learn to love your failing heart as long as there was loving to be done. We gotta learn to love our failing hearts. Learn from you and take that spot, for the love we give is the love we live. We gotta learn to love our failing hearts. Learn from you and take that spot, for the love we give is the love we live. For the love we give is the love we live.
Hello there. Remember me? I'm Peg O'Sullivan. And I love storytellers and I love storytelling.